Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the EFG London Jazz Festival. Welcome to Article 10, Conversations in the Era of Black Lives Matter. This is the last in a series of talks looking at jazz and social issues. Hopefully you've joined us over the last few nights where we've had some fantastic guests talking about a number of very important subjects that affect Black artists in the industry and in society in general. In the light of the important events that have occurred this year, notably the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, the wave of protest around the world, and the bigger conversation about Black history, the representation of Black history with regard to subjects such as colonialism, imperialism, and slavery, the toppling of statues, etc. So on Monday, we had a fantastic session with Orphy Robinson and Carleen Anderson, talking about the plight of revolutionaries struggling against reactionaries. Last night we had an equally compelling session with Jason Moran and Nicole Mitchell, who discussed the language of protest, made some really insightful points about the power of the music called jazz as a means of voicing opinions and making strong statements through both instrumental and vocal music as well. Tonight, I'm delighted to be joined by two fantastic guests who are going to help me to broach some of the issues regarding Black artists and the industry, the music industry and the institutions in the arts and entertainment world as well. Janine Irons, the CEO and co-founder of Tomorrow's Warriors, is with us. Janine, it's a pleasure to have you as part of this discussion. Welcome.
Thank you. Bye.
And also Amo Talwar of Punch Records, a really important agency and platform for emerging artists. It's been doing fantastic work in Birmingham and around the country for over 20 years now. Amo, a pleasure to have you with us. Welcome.
Thanks for having us on the show.
So we're here to talk about the industry and institutions and the way that Black artists in jazz and other forms of music as well have had to negotiate them over the years. There's a long history of exploitation, discrimination, all kinds of very challenging things befalling Black artists in the industry. And unfortunately, those issues are still with us today. We'll start with you, Amo, because you've just been tasked to head up this really important initiative. It's the UK Music Diversity Task Force, looking at some of these issues in the industry. Can you tell me about this project, what the aims are, and how you see it unfolding?
Sure. So before I talk about the report, and often people want to look at actions, I think we've got to look back. This year has just been an unbelievable year. I think people forget we had Brexit in January.
Yeah.
We've had COVID in March. We've had the murder of George Floyd. We've had statues being dismantled. We've had fiscal intervention by the Chancellor in terms. We've connected with words called furlough, which were unknown to us.
Which we didn't know before, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think we've had Blackout Tuesday. We've had labels. We've had the whole industry just taking time out to reflect, to look at injustice, justice, equality, and equity. We've had words like white privilege, systemic racism, becoming more and more familiar in terms of the conversations we're having. And you know, we've had time to reflect, but also people now want to ultimately see actions. The hashtags, the black squares, they were good for that moment in time, but what are we going to do about it? So under all of this inertia and movement, ourselves at the UK Music Diversity Task Force were about to release a survey, and we really had to just pause and think about what was going on in the world, not just in music, but just us as global citizens. And we threw a survey out, and obviously it was really well absorbed by musicians and the workforce. This survey and the study was primarily looking at workforce, so it was definitely behind the scenes rather than on the stage, which I think is really important to
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because we know that on stage it can look okay. You've had Dave, winning, Stormzy and Dave doing amazing shows at the Brits. So people think, hey, we're diverse. When it comes to workforce, it's not as good as it could be. So we collected some data, but data ultimately means nothing without roundtable discussions. We need a lived experience. So we didn't just put out a report analyzing data. We triangulated all this information and we put out a report. But alongside the report, what we needed was some actions that were accountable, that were metrics based, that were based around people's experiences, that hold everybody through this complex musical ecosystem to account. But it's also about progress and how we move things forward. So the report was, some of it was good, some of it was not so good. Statistically, there's more ethnic minorities coming into the workforce, but we know there's blocks and there's holes and there's gaps. So if you look at, say, things like gender pay gap, we have a phenomenal amount of work to do on the disparity between men and women getting paid. We know there's a block when it comes to ethnic minorities in senior positions. We know there's a block when it comes to women. So, our actions were let's go to the problems and let's unblock, or let's talk about the issues. And we came out with a 10-point plan. And this has been rolled out through all the 10 trade bodies that UK music represents. So it's the first time we've actually really dug deep in terms of granular work.
Okay, we'll come to that 10-point plan in a moment and go into it in detail. Janine, as the CEO of a really important organisation that has nurtured several generations of jazz musicians, you've provided a platform for so many young musicians who may not have been able to get a foothold in the industry otherwise. How do you feel about something like the diversity report? Presumably some of these issues that Amo's talking about are things that you've had to grapple with as well during your career.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all why we even started. Why we needed Tomorrow's Warriors in the first place. And so when we started, although there was a bit of a jazz scene, I couldn't see people who looked like me or who looked like Gary represented.
This is Gary Crosby, co-founder and bass player, band leader, etc. Yeah.
We couldn't see very many of people who looked like us and who came from backgrounds like us. And but we could see that there were people out there who had talent, they just didn't have access to the opportunities.
Yeah.
So creating a platform for people who look like us to come and access training, and performance opportunities, and just trying to get a foot into the industry was pretty much, our starting point, why we started it. But also, there weren't very many women there as well. And, the jam session, which is like, the soul of jazz, really, where people...
Lifeblood of the music,
yeah. There would generally be an awful lot of testosterone on the stage, and it would, in itself, it would deter a lot of young women from being brave enough to step up, So there was a lot of work to be done. And, unfortunately, at the time, there weren't as many of the, the courses and everything that you can do now. So it was really instinct. We were driven by what what we just felt was right, what needed to be done. And at each stage, as we came across a barrier that we had to get past, or a rung that we had to put in place, you know, that's what we did. So from the jam session, as we could see the young musicians developing, then they needed a gig, you know, but you try and get them a gig, they haven't got any materials to promote themselves. So, you know, we would help them record, and hence Gene Records at the time. Of course, none of the majors were interested in young jazz musicians.
Yeah.
So, you know, and always there was that pressure of having to sell enough music in order to justify any kind of investment. And so, you know, that in itself was a huge barrier. So sweeping that aside, and then, you know, creating the next stage of development was again something that Tomorrow's Warriors did, and we felt we had to do. Otherwise, you know, how on earth would any of them progress further? And I suppose having an eye on what was the prize, you know, where did we want our young people to get to? We could see opportunities out there, how to access them, you know, we didn't know, to be honest. And so then it was about creating the opportunities. If we couldn't access the opportunities that were there, let's create our own. You know, Gary often talks about that Spike Lee film, you know, Do the Right Thing, and you know, having to build our own wall so that we can access, we can see people who look like us, we can have access to great opportunities, we can have access to progress and become, you know, we can be the best we can be, really. So building the wall, building the platform, creating opportunities through performances, through tours, learning the ropes ourselves. I mean, it really was a, you know, self-learn project, I think. And for many years, it's been that. But thankfully now, you know, there are more opportunities to learn. There are more courses. So yeah.
And ironically, we see the huge success of artists like Nubia Garcia, for example, who has just released the debut album on Concord Records, which presumably when you started, both with the June record label and with Tomorrow's Warriors, would have been more or less unthinkable to have a young artist signing a major label recording contract with all of the kind of publicity and marketing that comes with that. Her profile is very high. So that's kind of testimony to the work that you started several decades ago.
I think, you know, with Nubia is a very special case, I think. And we're really, really proud of her because I think she did it the right way. She stuck out. She stuck it out. You know, there were lots of people trying to get to her, you know, which was interesting because when she went to, when she wanted to apply to conservatoire, I mean, she was rejected twice, you know, and it was soul destroying for her. Yeah. And I think in that situation, that's where Tomorrow's Warriors was incredibly important because, you know, what would she do? She was trying to get to the States, but to go to Berkeley would have cost her an absolute fortune. You know, the sort of resources she didn't have access to. Yeah. And then we were in danger of losing somebody like Nubia, you know, of her giving up with those levels of rejection. But Tomorrow's Warriors was there and was able to just keep her engaged, keep her learning for another year.
So you provided a support structure.
Absolutely, you know, until she was able to get into conservatoire, and then look where she is now, you know. So she has learnt the ropes, again, another self-learner, you know. So instead of just jumping straight into a management contract or a record contract, she's done a lot herself, you know. She's booked her own gigs, she's organised her own tours, and, you know, she's done her own recordings. And, you know, and she's the stronger for it, I would suggest. So now when she's, you know, she's signed to Concord, I mean, that's an incredible feat.
Yeah, it's an achievement, for sure.
I'm so proud of her, really proud of her. And I hope that well, I know that she will be a very important role model for all the young women, or particularly the young instrumentalists coming after her.
So Emma, let's come back to you. Janine's given us a really important and inspiring sort of case study there with Nubaya. And she's raised these equally important issues of gender, development, investment, providing a support structure. I think these are some of the things that really do need to be discussed and maybe need to be furthered within the music industry. So can we come back to the 10-point plan and give us the rundown on some of the initiatives that are going to be taken, hopefully, or just maybe the discussions that have been taking place to make sure that things can move in the right direction?
Sure. So I think there was some conversations already taking place in the music industry. So, you know, let's get rid of the word urban and can we just be genre specific? Jazz, called jazz. It's really weird when you connect and you lump, like, say, jazz, dancehall, and you know, trap under the moniker of urban. And so, you know, one of the first things we said,
it doesn't really work, does it?
Well, is it Soweto Kinch or is it Bounty Killer? You know, it's quite broad. So I think there's a whole thing around being okay with saying the word black and saying black music. So I had a record store for my sins. I thought I'd grow old. And
famous Punch record store in Birmingham.
I thought I'd grow old and grey, selling like Northern jazz or soul or funk, but obviously Napster and downloading came in and killed us. But joking aside, so things like there was some really simple stuff. Can we get rid of the acronym BAME, which is hugely complex, and I know we're going to talk about that in a bit. We also want to know diversity in the workforce means nothing without three things. You need transparency, you need accountability, and you need strategy. Transparency is all about we need to do it together. We need to be collaborative. We shouldn't do it in silos. So we didn't connect the 10-point plan just to the data. We looked at the roundtable discussion, the lived experience, and it was rounded. We need accountability, so we need to know who's responsible and accountable. Two very different things. Because if everybody's responsible, no one's responsible. And then the third thing is you can't develop diversity metrics and strategy without money or resources or time. Investment. So we had to overcome those hurdles, and then we start looking at where are the blocks. So we know that the data tells us that there's a massive influx of ethnic minorities and women in that lower end. When I say lower end, the early stages, the 16 to sort of 25. We know that as people grow older, there's a problem, there's a block. What is the block? Why is there a problem with senior people coming that look like Janine and that talk like Kevin? So is it about policy? So we need to start looking at people's policies, and we need to look at training programs. We need to look at more investment. We need to look at, things like gender pay gap is really interesting. It's a problem. But we need to look at, well, what is the problem? Do we need to share more information about our pay and structures, and things like putting metrics and targets as well? So, and the key to the 10-point plan, I think, was it was collaborative. So we didn't do it in silo. We worked with the trade bodies, and we got sign off from every single CEO and chairman. So therefore, now it's quite a well-respected 10-point plan that people want to move forward with, and it's quite simple. So our words we try to simplify the words in the 10-point plan, but we needed to make sure that they ultimately have impact and we see progress. So the 10-point plan is available on the UK Music website. It's quite well it's signed off by the industry, and we hope that it will make the change that we feel it can make.
In real terms, are you actually putting this plan to record labels, producers, venue owners, like the decision makers within the industry, the people who hold power, to ensure that they change their attitude so they become more inclusive?
So under the moniker of UK Music, we represent 10 trade bodies: the BPI, AIM, PRS, MU, PPL, FAC, MPG, the total ecosystem. And so there's been sign off and from every single trade body. Now, sometimes that doesn't necessarily mean that a record label would do that, but we're hoping that the second tier, which is the labels and the more public facing stuff, will adopt similar concepts around a plan, specifically looking at gender and race. We're also not we had a focus on gender and race for this year primarily because of what's happened, but we're also we're not negating disability, LGBT, and all the other protected characteristics. We're bringing them in slowly, one by one, and we're also releasing we're hoping to release all the data because it's GDPR protected and redacted in terms of names, so we can start sharing with people what's working and what's not. Will it change the industry? Let's have this conversation in a year's time. But I can tell you for now, boards are changing. It takes time to sort out the execs because you can't just fire people. But you have to ensure that people understand their bias or their echo chamber. And we talk a lot about systemic problems or systemic racism. And to address systemic problems, we need systems change, not tokenistic talent development programs that we've all seen, and a lot of them have come and gone. Systems change takes time, and it takes for each one of us to have really uncomfortable conversations about our own bias. So it's really easy for diverse communities to talk about white privilege, but I talk about place privilege. Then I talk about gender privilege, and then I talk about white privilege, because privilege is not just about the color of your skin. It's about living your life without having to deal with racism or all the issues that we have to deal with day in, day out.
Janine, food for thought there. Dealing with the whole issue of privilege, power, decision making, but also just kind of rewinding to the start of that statement from Amo as well. The thorny problem of classification, a term like urban, which has always been incredibly problematic, I think because of the kind of reductive image that it portrays of Black artists. You are urban, you are from the city, you are tough, you are quote unquote, and possibly somebody who's been involved in illegal activity. Everything that comes with that term, I think, has been problematic from the outset. And it's interesting that I think Drake and a couple of other leading artists have distanced themselves, or they may have dropped the term completely in the last few months, right at the height of the BLM activity. And related to that, the use of the term Black music, not even embracing, recognizing the history of Black music and recognizing that there is nothing wrong with the term Black music. Carleen Anderson, when she was asked on Monday about jazz festivals in the UK and whether they were a sufficient representation of the music's Black heritage, she said, I think in a very enlightened way, that whether the artists are Black or white, they're still playing Black music. Because an artist isn't Black, that doesn't mean that they're not part of Black culture. That it's always been very inclusive anyway. And there seems to be this kind of fear of the word Black, fear of the term Black music. And I think, through Tomorrow's Warriors and other initiatives as well that we've seen over the years, you guys have been fighting against that and showing that, there is a way to embrace this term Black music and to embrace women, to embrace all kinds of diversity, and be inclusive and be constructive. So I don't know whether you want to pick up on some of the things that Amo's been talking about.
Well, I think that whole issue around, calling black music is a perennial problem, really.
Yeah.
And certainly my own experience in certain circles is that when you do mention, or if you do call even jazz black music, there's a pushback, like, well, it's not just black music, it's not just black people, it's like, no, nobody says others haven't contributed to it, but, we have to recognize its origins, and
its
there's
roots,
absolutely no getting away from it, So, and to be honest, it's tiresome having to keep, arguing that same point.
Yeah.
So, yes, let's call it black music. Let's not be embarrassed about it, and let's not be fragile about it either. Certainly at Warriors, when young people come into our space, I think they all recognise that they are coming into a space that celebrates black music. No two ways about it. And I suppose,
but whether they're black or white, they're very welcome, because you've nurtured a lot of white artists as well.
Absolutely, which is another interesting thing, because so many times I've had people say, "Oh, well, Tomorrow's Warriors it only works with black musicians." It's like, no, it doesn't.
Oh, true.
And it never has.
Yeah.
It never has been an all black thing.
I think that's to do with bias as well. I think people have really, really big echo chambers, and we all have bias. But I think sometimes people don't recognize their own bias, and also people, don't recognize privilege. It's a hard thing. It's a really hard thing for humans to understand and acknowledge they may have some of that.
But what's interesting there, Amo, is that because Tomorrow's Warriors was set up to address underrepresentation of black people and women, some white people will then feel that they are being excluded in some way, when that has never been, the way we work. But somehow, it's like the Black Lives Matter, all lives matter sort of thing. It's black musicians matter, or all musicians matter. Well, of course they do. Nobody argues against that. But it's just the fact that we're having to put focus on people of colour who want to progress in this industry doesn't mean to say that we have to exclude anybody, and we're not.
If we broaden the conversation for a moment, I think the fact that we've just had Black History Month is apposite, for this conversation. We're talking about the year of Black Lives Matter, and we've just had our annual celebration of black culture. And I think the growing fatigue with that as a concept, and the way we question that concept and think, but can it really just be reduced to a month? Can it be turned into a box ticking exercise, especially when you hear of stories of certain companies deciding that they want to have a Black History Month initiative this year for the first time, that they'll hire somebody black to do a talk or be in conversation with another person, etc., and then they won't actually pay them for it. then you have to question exactly what Black History Month as a concept is achieving, and whether it's been just turned into a box ticking exercise. And I think this idea of saying, right, okay, we'll put a focus on Black history or Black culture, but nonetheless it will be in a separate corner. It will be somehow in a different place, in a stratified society or a stratified music industry, is incredibly problematic. And presumably that's still something that you're having to deal with, that, Amo.
Yeah, I think what we have to do is as a non-religious person, we have to look at truth, and we have to get to the truth. So if you look at, say, our popular cities, London, Manchester, Birmingham, these cities are 40 to nearly 50% non-white British. We have to, not just as musicians and artists, but people in the workforce, be more reflective. So Janine said something earlier. If I can't see somebody that looks like me, talks like me, eats food like me, is loud like me, why would I be inspired to even warrant coming into that industry? And we've had too many colleagues who are Asian, Black, working class, who have come to our industry and gone. I'll use the mayor of Bristol as a really good example. He used to work at the BBC. He was in our creative industries music domain, and he just left because he couldn't see change, or the glass ceiling was too big, and he went into politics, and now he's the mayor of Bristol. My point is, if we don't create opportunities, access, because talent is everywhere, access isn't. The route to becoming an exceptional artist, your talent is, you can find talent in Newcastle, Swansea, small towns, villages, but we need to create more access. And that is, the elephant in the room is, class, social mobility. But unfortunately, I'm Indian, you're from Trinidad. Janine, I'm not sure where you're from, but sometimes our race and our gender and our ethnicity become the contributing main factor. But actually, a lot of it is about social mobility and class.
If we're talking about social mobility and class, and this very practical question of budgets, funding, financial support to enable the next generation of Nubaya Garcia or Moses Boyd or Cassie Kanoshi or whoever it may be to fulfill their talent. Finding the money, you know very well, Janine, that's essentially what you have to do. It's such a key part of the work of Tomorrow's Warriors. Do you feel, both of you, maybe you could start, Janine, that jazz and black music are still struggling with being lower down the hierarchy? If we think of the establishment's view of culture in this country, with opera and classical music being at the top, pop being right down at the bottom, jazz maybe being somewhere, I'm not entirely sure where, it depends on what the particular project is, but I think that question of a divide between opera and classical music and the rest still seems like a massive hurdle to overcome to me.
It is. I mean, some would argue that, classical and opera, because they have, particularly with opera, huge expensive sets and, huge numbers of people on stage and whatnot. So, and therefore they can justify their share of the
funding part.
Yeah. But actually, they also have access to bigger pots of wealth in the demographic that they're appealing to, and to corporates, to all these other sponsorship and funding opportunities that people working in other genres don't necessarily have. And again, that is down to, very much a class issue.
Yeah.
So, funding for jazz, I think, it's possibly better than it was, I would suggest. But it's taken years. I mean, we've been going nearly 30 years, and it's only really now that we're seeing the needle move a bit. But that's also about funding being available not only to organisations but to artists. So if you look at the overall picture, then it's possibly better. But funding for a jazz organisation, I would suggest that we're very fortunate, we get funding from the Arts Council, which is great, but it's a tiny amount in comparison to what we do, the reach we have, the impact we have. It's actually quite small beer, to be honest. And whilst I wouldn't want to knock them down, I would say that particularly after this year, that they take a really close look at how funding is being apportioned, across the board, you know, and taking in all the different aspects of how and where an organisation gets its funding from. So certainly with us, we've had to do an awful lot of individual giving, work on individual giving, you know, through our crowdfunding, which has been really heartening, because clearly the people who are consuming jazz see our value, you know, and people who are also consuming other forms of music, they see our value as a music organisation and as an important part in society, you know, and in building diversity and celebrating diversity. So they will support us. But the other side of that is, you know, when it comes to trusts and foundations, for some reason we really struggle. And I'm always bemused how certain people can get funding for, you know, yet another artist development program or another talent development program, which kind of goes to nowhere and has no real impact, and has no Black people in, you know, actually within the organisation, so no lived experience. Yet that can be funded so easily, and yet, you know, a funder can turn around and say, yes, if we want to support, you know, diversity, getting more Black people doing, you know, working in the industry or playing music, yet they won't make the effort, I think, to actually look into an organisation that is Black-led and that has Black people at its core, and that its beneficiaries are also the people they claim to be trying to support.
Do you think it's also a question of winning the argument? Not that I feel that the argument needs to be won, but maybe to make it clear to people that what we're dealing with jazz and Black music is high art. That if you look at, I mean, just look at the foundations: Armstrong, Ellington, Coltrane, Billie Holiday, Miles Davis, etc. I mean, these are artists who are peerless, who are really in the pantheon, and I think.
And they totally
maybe making it clear to people that this is an art form which requires huge amounts of talent to be able to do well, not to mention time, investments of time, real commitment. That this is not just another form of music. This is something which is on a very high level.
I think that's a really important point, Kevin, about you know, the music has been elevated by people like Ellington and Coltrane and Armstrong, all of them, you know, elevated it to a high art form. But I think there's still this problem about, can we see it as equal to the European classical
canon? Yeah.
You know, will it ever be? Is the question, and until such time as we can see the two at the same level, I don't believe that jazz will ever get the amount of support that it actually deserves.
Amo?
Yeah, I mean, I would go a little bit harder and a bit, you know, so I'm not in the jazz world, so I can say, I think you're dealing with systemic racism, and let me just break down what that means. You have the four components of systemic racism. You have the institution, and so people know of institutional racism primarily through the Macpherson report, through what happened in London in the mid-90s. You have the structural racism, which is I'll use COVID as an example. Working class, ethnic minorities, you have layers, systems, you know, no parks, really bad air, really bad health, etc., etc. The systems, COVID-19. You have the interpersonal, which is about the microaggression. So it's all the stuff that Janine has had over the years that she just lived with, and you think, oh God, not that again. And then you have the unconscious. Oh, I didn't realize I I didn't realize I was biased. So you have the four components of systemic racism: the structural, the institutional, the interpersonal, and the unconscious. No one wants to deal with that. Funders don't, organizations don't, the whole supply chain doesn't. And it's too, has the dial moved? Yeah, it's moved a little bit. Does it need a complete shake-up? Probably. Do we need some new voices? Not just pretty brown and black faces on boards. I'm talking about, this isn't about Janine on a board or Ammo on a board. It's not about that. This is about systems change. And systems change takes time, energy, and we need to collaborate. And that's the whole system. So it's not jazz, because I think you guys are doing all right when it comes to funding. Look at the grime guys or the drill guys. You know, what are they getting? Imagine if grime was invested the way jazz was 20 years ago. We'd have some really, our Skeptors, our JMEs, all that stuff would be a lot further than what it is. So actually, it's the lens that we look at things, or the people with power. So it's actually a dismantling of the power structure, unfortunately.
And having a broad vision.
Yeah. So
vision, yeah.
Completely. So can we have some new people, new voices? Because don't forget, you may have diversity, but you may not have representation. Because I may be, a brown person that can sit on a board, but I don't represent, every single South Asian person there is. So you need that diversity of thought as well as representation, as well as diversity. But this is really hard to get. It's even harder to acknowledge that you need it. And if you have lived experience, Janine's got 30 years of probably microaggressions. She's probably got untold stories about her hair, her lipstick, her skin tone, or whatever. We need to get to grips with this as men. And until we have a sense of honesty about our own vision of what this thing could look like, we're going to struggle. And so you can talk about the greats, you can talk about Ellington, you can talk about, the sonic sounds that have come out of this sort of genre we call jazz. But until we look at the totality of the system, we're going to struggle, I think.
I think it's all about power structures as well, isn't it, really? So it's and understanding that when we're talking inclusion, it does mean that somebody is going to have to leave their seat, to enable new voices to come in and to give voice, not just to be there as a name, on a sheet of paper. It's actually got to be able to give voice. And also, Amma, you just touched on it about you can't be the representative for everything. It's like the number of times I've been in a room where, suddenly I'm the representative of the entire Black community.
You have to know everything there is to know about Black people and Black history and Black culture.
Well, Janine knows everything about Ethiopians and St. Lucian. So, obviously she's got that spectrum.
Yeah. If we're talking about systems and power structures, then even though we live in an age where obviously digital media has come into its own, many artists are releasing music independently without going to record labels, etc. I still wonder whether there's a need to have labels as supporters, as links in the chain to actually give artists a leg up when they need it, and to make sure that the work is properly documented as well. That's one thing which was kind of hinted at on Monday when we were talking about Ronell Shaw's Windrush Suite, which is a really fantastic piece of work looking at a very, very important political issue that needs to be discussed: the Windrush scandal, the deportation of West Indians. All of that is hugely important. Do you feel that we still need record labels to support jazz artists, to give them the kind of platforms for their work, even though we live in an age where people can release music independently?
You're going to go, mate. Go on then.
No, you go first. You go first. It's your arena, Jazz.
No, I was saying, you know, whether it's a label as we know it, or whether it's just, you know, some form of support, really.
Because I'm thinking as well, Janine, about June Records, the label, which is a fantastic label, and I feel that it wound down at precisely the time it was needed to be able to bring more artists through. If you think about what you managed to release in the time that it was in operation, records by Robert Mitchell, records by J Life, introducing Jason Yard and Julie Dexter from Birmingham to the world, records by Dennis Baptiste, Let Freedom Ring. That's a really important album. And I think, well, it is a really important album. It's making a strong political statement. It's fantastic music. And I feel that to a certain extent, some of the younger artists who are now enjoying the limelight and more acclaim, that they should also be on the next wave of June Record releases. So.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree, actually. I think, I mean, they would be perfect for what the label stood for. Unfortunately, you know, there just wasn't enough support, and there was only so much money that Gary and I could sink into a label that, you know, a big release for us would be, you know, like 20,000 units or something, you know. And over the period of 20 years, maybe 40,000 units, you know. But yeah, I mean, if we had it today, I mean, it would be an amazing label, but it would need so much investment, because it was all about, well, essentially giving young artists their first release. Yeah. But also it was the tour support that went behind it as well. So it was, you know, what is the whole thing? It was the development of the artist, you know, over the long term, over several years, then the recording, then the touring. And it takes a huge amount of money, you know, to do that. It's easier, I think, to do all of those things now, because the cost of producing all those things has come down. Yeah. But I do still believe that artists need support from somewhere, because, you know, they need to be given the time to create, you know, and to be artists. Having to worry about all the other things, you know, producing albums, booking tours, marketing, all of that stuff. Not every artist can be a great businessman as well. Yeah. And, you know, we've got a number of young artists who are like supremely talented, but they're going to be totally rubbish when it comes to marketing themselves, you know, because that's not who they are. They are great artists, and they write great music, they play great music. That's where their focus is. Yeah. So yes, we are still going to need, whether it's labels or somebody, to give them that support so they can get on and do what they do best, which is to create great music. Amo, do you still see that need as well in the industry to have either labels or producers to provide that support system for the artist?
Yeah, I think you can have a bit of both. I think I don't think you'll ever get rid of the machine, but at the same time, I think the sense of independence is becoming a familiar voice. So one can intrinsically live quite well with the other. So you can have, you know, independent artists that are totally independent artists that go through major labels. I think we need variables in our you know, from when artists make work to how they release it. So I don't see there being a problem having big labels and small labels. I think as long as there's a real sense of equity across the board, I think that's the key. I think more artists are looking to sort of keep all of their own, to keep ownership, isn't it? Yeah. That's happening more often now, which is good. You know, that's a really good sign. Yeah. Yeah, and it makes labels work that much harder, actually, to attract those artists, I think.
We've just got a few minutes to go before we wrap up, folks. I want to come back, just to close, to this essential question that we've been discussing for the last 3 nights about political statements and artists who are brave enough, who are willing to broach the issues that need to be broached, whether it's racial injustice or issues of gender or issues of ecology or climate change or whatever it may be across the board. I think when you look at the likes of Cassie Kinoshi, Moses Boyd, who've made strong political statements, Ronelle Shaw, who we mentioned before as well, who did the Windrush suite, there's real cause for optimism when you think about how these artists, these young artists, have stepped up to the plate and they've actually become spokespeople. They've been brave enough to voice, I think, the frustrations and the very necessary outrage at the government, at the authorities, at the powers that be. Surely that must fill you with a degree of optimism. I mean, when you heard that Moses Boyd's Dark Matter was shortlisted for the Mercury Music Prize, and when you listen to the content of the work, what he's actually talking about, similarly, Cassie Kinoshi's Seed Ensemble, where there are statements about Grenfell, you know, the need for social justice, etc. I think that does give us a degree of energy, nonetheless.
I think
Yeah, I mean, I think Black artists historically have always been political. If you look at, you know, if you trace the history of the blues, Howling Wolves, you know, the politics, you know, the Public Enemy, Reaganomics, you know, Dave talking about Black is beautiful. You know, I think that the politics have always been energized, and I think ultimately it's always the youth that are pushing the agenda forward. I think if you look at, say, UK Black Lives Matter, the movement, it's been very, very reflective of modern day Britain. It's been very diverse. And I think the sounds and the sonics and the stories that are coming out of what's happening now will only push the envelope in terms of whether it's drill, trap, grime, hip hop, reggae. So I'm always, you know, I'm always quintessentially positive. I just want change to happen a little bit quicker.
Don't we all? Janine?
I agree. I mean, it's always been about making political statements with music, but I think it's possibly easier now. I think for, you know, the artists who are there now to make those statements. You know, when I know when we first started Tomorrow's Warriors, we were almost fearful about, I mean, even Let Freedom Ring, for example, you know,
which was looking at Dr. Martin Luther King's Lincoln Memorial speech. Yeah,
you know, I know we came in for some criticism from some quarters about, you know, it's not like that anymore. Why do you even have to go over it again? You know, whereas that album and the message from it, I think, will always be relevant. You know, sadly, it will always be relevant. So yeah, I think it's fantastic that these young artists, and particularly the young women, feel comfortable just coming straight out, and, you know, they're not pulling any punches, and nor should they, to get their point across.
Fantastic note on which to end. Janine, Amo, thank you very much for this final session of Article 10, Conversations in the Era of Black Lives Matter. It's been a real pleasure to host you tonight, as it has been hosting the likes of Nicole Mitchell and Jason Moran and Ulfi Robinson and Carleen Anderson over the last few nights. We've talked about many things, many essential things, the need for artists to continue speaking out against social justice, the challenges that they face, the need for artists to speak out against oppression, to speak for social justice, the challenges that they face in doing so, the inequalities that we still all have to face in our daily lives. That's part of this experience that we're going through, and I think the artists are helping us to negotiate that as best as possible. So thank you very much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of the EFG London Jazz Festival, and from Amo, Janine and myself, good night.